Well, good afternoon, everybody. To those of you without a drink, with those of you with a drink, good evening. We're at that middle part of the day where it's neither one or the other. Well, welcome to the Grand Salon. I hope you've had a lovely day. It was beautiful out there again today. And later on this evening, please join us back in here at 9:30 for the Shamrock Tenors. But first of all, if you missed what Andrew's first talk, it is on the TV for you to catch up on, and any of our other talks as well. But ladies and gentlemen, liveryman of the City of London, he's here to talk a little bit about the Industrial Revolution. Please welcome a great friend of Seabourn, Andrew Johnson.
Thank you very much indeed, James. Just before I do start, I've had lots and lots of questions from people and comments about people emigrating from Europe and setting up new settlements around the world, following on from the talk that I did yesterday. So I've agreed with James, we're going to do an extra talk tomorrow where I'm going to focus on the European diaspora, how Europeans come to be in places around the world, why the people of Nova Scotia speak with a Scots accent, and why the buildings in Dunedin in New Zealand's South Island look like somewhere in the Scottish Middlelands. So we'll touch on that tomorrow. Back here, same time, and I hope that you'll choose to join us. Now, you will know, I hope, of my interest in the history of travel, of exploration. It's really all based, in my mind, my interest is how has the world changed because of? How has the world changed because of the discoveries of the New World? How has the world changed because of the development of the Silk Road and so on? And one of the most important factors in our modern world, the globalized consumerism world, is the Industrial Revolution of the 18th and 19th centuries. It grew from a few small sparks of people in the English Midlands, around Birmingham especially. And what I want to do is to try to address why it happened there and why it happened then, and what the impacts of that are. If you've been with me before, and I think all of you have, you'll know I have an interest in signs and the use of language and its appropriateness. I only have one for you tonight, but I think it is clear why I've chosen to show you this one. It is not the clearest view around, and I have no idea what it says under the word clear view. So someone probably ought to get out with the secateurs. Now, throughout human history, coal has been used as an energy source, primarily burned for the production of heat. Originally, of course, open fires and so on, but coal is the largest source worldwide of the energy that's needed to produce electricity. It's also the largest source of carbon dioxide emissions around the world. The extraction of coal, its use in energy production, and its byproducts are all associated with environmental and health effects. The earliest recognized use is from the Shenyang area of China. About 6,000 years ago, people were burning coal. Neolithic inhabitants had begun carving ornaments from black lignite. Coal from the Fushun mine in northeastern China was used to smelt copper as early as 1000 BC. And when Marco Polo went on his grand mission to China, one of the things that he noted in his book, Il Milione, was this black stone that could be burned. He was so impressed by it. Now, in Britain, there is evidence that during the Bronze Age, outcrop coal was used where it had been detected as forms of forming the composition of ancient funeral pyres. Usually those were constructed of timber, of wood, but coal would be used to increase the heat. And with the exception of 2 modern fields, the Romans were exploiting coals in all the major coal fields in England and Wales by the end of the 2nd century. Mineral coal came to be referred to as sea coal in the 13th century. The wharf where the material arrived in London was known as Sea Coal Lane, so identified in a charter by Henry III, which was granted in 1253. And James just mentioned that I'm a liveryman of the City of London. I'm interested in trade in, around, and the history of the city. And Sea Coal Lane, on this map, is just down here. That is a map of the old City of London. And I'm going to come back. I'm going to come back in a week, I think, and talk about the stories of the City of London. But coal was shipped from Newcastle upon Tyne to London for the smiths and lime burners who were building Westminster Abbey. And when I say shipped, I do mean shipped. It was brought in coal-carrying craft. Following the Great Fire of London in 1666, the architect Christopher Wren was tasked with recreating or creating a new landscape for the city. He proposed the widening of this river that you can see coming into the Thames just here. That is the River Fleet. And he proposed that it should be canalised, made into a larger flowing river that would serve the Thames and the city beyond. But in its place, they just created a relatively minor new canal. Newcastle Close, Old Sea Coal Lane, now just short alleyways in the City of London off Farringdon. That's really all that's left of the wharfs that brought coal to London from Newcastle. And here you can see the merchant collier, the Earl of Pembroke. That is one of the better versions, but quite typical of the craft that would carry coal from Newcastle down to London. And this one was converted to be Captain Cook's HMS Endeavour. He sailed to the other side of the world in a craft that was built to carry coal from Newcastle to London. No one would have imagined it could be used for anything of the sort. And this is 368 tons. Now, yesterday I was talking about craft that were 4,000 tons and saying how small they were. This is only 1/10 of the size. And the area of South Wales that we're going to tomorrow is famous for its coal production as well. Not in the port that we're going to, but really not very far away. And Fishguard and the other ports around have been used for conveying coal out of that area as well. But so back to coal. By the 13th century, easily accessible sources had largely become exhausted. That is, those that could be scraped out just by removing the topsoil or just by relatively minor extraction. So underground extraction by shaft mining developed. And the coal from these shafts was called pit coal, and coal pits developed for the first time. And before the steam engine, pits were often shallow, bell pits, because they really couldn't get any deeper into them because they just didn't have the technology. And they had the added problem of removing water from them because water would enter and water would accumulate. The introduction of the steam pump by Savary in 1698 and the Newcomen steam engines about 14 years later facilitated the removal of water. They enabled shafts to be made deeper. And when we get to the Isle of Man, to Douglas, I lose track of days, but later this week, so 1, 2, 3 days on, one of the sites that you can see is the largest steam pump wheel still in existence. It is really very impressive. So coal was to be the fuel of the Industrial Revolution as the steam engine took over from the water wheel, because up to then it had been water power that had driven the early machinery. In 1700, 5/6 of the world's coal was mined in Britain, and people in the Mediterranean were really fairly unaware of it, mostly because they didn't need the intense heat that coal can produce, and they didn't have the drive for creation, for manufacturing that was developing in Britain. So Britain continued to be important in coal production really until quite recently. In 1947, there were 750,000 coal miners in Britain. 20 years ago, that had dropped to 5,000 working in 20 collieries, and now it's almost non-existent. My father grew up in South Yorkshire. He grew up in a town called Rotherham, which is surrounded by coal mines and steel mills. And his brothers, cousins, uncles, and so on, all ended up either in the steel mills or in the coal mines. And my dad decided that he really didn't want to do that. Not that he was afraid of hard work, because he most certainly wasn't, but he wanted to be outside. In fact, he wanted to be a jockey, and he was only 5'7", smaller even when he was younger. So at the age of 14, he left school, which is what people did in those days, and rather than go into the steel mills where his father expected him to go, he ran away. And he ran away to Newmarket, which is one of our, or Newmarket as it's known locally, which is one of our major horse livery centres, racing horse livery centres, and he got himself a job in a stable. He never made it to be a jockey, but what he did do was to go on to be a very successful officer in the British Army Physical Training Corps. It's in the genes, you can tell. The mines produced a very powerful social record as well. The miners wrote in their limited way, but what they did do so well was to use art to depict their stories and their lives. And there are examples in the Pitman papers, a delightful story of a group of gritty Ashington miners who went on an art appreciation course run by the Workers' Educational Association, the WEA. And many of them went on to become well-known painters. Almost forgotten was George Bissell, an outstanding artist, really had talent that no one would have expected. And examples of his work, many portraying the harsh working conditions, can be found in various galleries and at the National Coal Museum near Wakefield in Yorkshire. So back to my question, why there and why then? Well, the Industrial Revolution, as I'm sure you know, was the transition to new manufacturing processes. It was in the period from 1760 to the early part of the 19th century. And this transition included going from hand production to machine production, new chemical manufacturing, iron production processes, the increasing use of steam power, the development of machine tools, and the rise of the factory systems. Textiles were the dominant industry of the Industrial Revolution in terms of employment, in terms of value of output, in terms of capital invested. And the textile industry was the first to use these modern production methods. This is Richard Arkwright's first spinning mill, Cromford Mill in Derbyshire, which he built in 1771. It contained his invention, the water frame. Arkwright used water wheels to power the textile machinery, and using a water wheel required the location on a source of water, and water that could be made to move fast. So that's why this mill is at Cromford, where there is such a source. The Industrial Revolution marks a major turning point in history. Almost every aspect of daily life for the majority of people was influenced in some way. In particular, average income and population showed unprecedented and sustained growth. People lived longer. Economists say that the major impact of the Industrial Revolution was that the standard of living for the general population began to increase consistently for the first time in history. Unfortunately, not everyone benefited. I'm going to come back to some of the terrible social impacts later on. The impacts of the Industrial Revolution feature quite heavily in Victorian literature. Hard Times. This is the 10th novel of Charles Dickens. It was first published in 1854, and the book surveys English society and it satirizes the social and economic conditions of the era. It is his only novel not to have scenes set in London. Instead, the story is set in the fictitious Victorian industrial town called Coketown, a sort of generic northern English mill town. In some ways, although smaller, in some ways it was very similar to Manchester at the time. Coketown may be partially based on Preston, the city slightly north of Manchester, or at least Preston as it was in the 19th century. Critics mainly focused on Dickens' treatment of trade unions and his post-industrial revolution pessimism regarding the divide between capitalist mill owners and undervalued workers during the Victorian era. One of the grand pictures of the era is what we grew up to know of as pea supers, the smog that hung over industrial towns. A smog that featured in Conan Doyle's, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's stories of Sherlock Holmes, where he and Dr. Watson would leave their digs at 221B Baker Street and head out possibly to Limehouse on the river to work their way through a case. But to get there, they had to travel through the smog that was the pea supers of London at the time. Author J.R.R. Tolkien grew up in Birmingham's Hall Green. He played around Sarehole Mill, which you see here. Beautiful, beautiful sight. He loved and he shared passion for this place, where he felt free as a child. And he was a child, so rightly so. Today, the magnificent trees shield the view from Sarehole Mill towards the city centre. But as he stood with his back to the mill, he would watch the smoke and grime billowing up from the factories of Birmingham. And this is a classic example from the time. He looked across traditional agricultural land towards what had become known as the Black Country. Black Country because of the black gold, the coal that was at the heart of the local economy. It's believed that he was inspired to create Mordor, the home of the orcs, filled with fire, smoke and noise because of what he witnessed as Birmingham developed as an industrial centre. The Industrial Revolution began in Great Britain, and many of the technical innovations were British. As an island nation, Britain was protected from attack by the seas around her and her navy, and where other Europeans had to concentrate their armies on protecting their land borders, the British Navy enabled Britain to control a global trading empire. Colonies in North America and Africa and Asia, the powerful Indian subcontinent controlled through the East India Company. Britain had a great freedom that other, even colonial powers, didn't have. Sadly, excuse me, sadly, this also included huge numbers of slaves being carried from Africa to the West Indies to provide the labour for the sugar plantations, to North America to provide the labour for the tobacco plantations and others. And they brought sugar which was used to sweeten the tea that the ladies would enjoy in the afternoon in the tea houses of London and elsewhere, to sweeten the coffee that the gentlemen would enjoy in the coffee houses of London, and to create a demand that simply didn't exist before. And it is argued, and I think very strongly argued, that the development of sugar, and especially the provision of slaves to allow it to be cultivated, corrupted society in a way that no one could possibly have imagined. But people needed the energy that sugar could provide to work the long hours that were now required of them. Factories were working long shifts. People were expected to multiply shifts. And the developments in the north of England, which started all of this, were driven by a perfect storm of technological advances in both manufacturing and transportation, inspired by men of vision. This is Matthew Boulton. He was among many enlightened men of the time. He was an English manufacturer and a business partner of Scottish engineer James Watt. In the final quarter of the 18th century, their partnership installed hundreds of Boulton and Watt steam engines around the world, around the country, which were a great advance on the state of the art, making possible the mechanization of factories and mills. Boulton applied modern techniques to the minting of coins, striking millions of pieces for Britain and other countries. And as a result, the British mint became the source of coinage for most of the world, not just in the British Empire. Because of his vision and his innovations, Boulton has been called the father of the Industrial Revolution. And he was a key member of the Lunar Society, a group of men from the Birmingham area, prominent in the arts, sciences, and theology. They met regularly between 1765 and 1813, and the members included Watt, Erasmus Darwin, not Charles Darwin, Erasmus Darwin, Josiah Wedgwood, William Murdoch, Joseph Priestley. There were others as well. And they've been given credit for developing concepts and techniques in science, agriculture, manufacturing, mining, and transport that laid the groundwork for the Industrial Revolution. The name, the Lunar Society, arose because, well, mostly because of the lack of street lighting. And so they would meet on the full moon because they knew they were safe to get home that night, safe from pickpockets or cut purses, because they would be travelling home in reasonable light. Now, this was just one group of forward-thinking innovators who discussed ideas openly, as well as in private mansions and coffee houses. In Britain, since the Civil War 100 years earlier, Parliament had facilitated the promotion of new ideas. And this was quite different from what was happening in France, for example, where all the research was under the control of the Academy of Science. And as a result, anything could take months, even years, to progress, because it would go through the hands of several committees. One of the Lunar Society, I mentioned James Watt. He was a Scottish inventor. You will know the name, I'm sure. He was a mechanical engineer. He greatly improved the steam engines originally created by Thomas Newcomen. Hitherto, they were used to pump water out of mines, and very successfully. But Watt developed a reciprocating engine in 1769, capable of powering a wheel for the first time. It was used to power cotton machinery by generating power to a wheel. It was a large stationary engine. You can see an example here. It couldn't be any other way. The state of boiler technology necessitated the use of low-pressure steam acting upon a vacuum in the cylinder and an enormous separate condenser and air pump. The first full-scale working railway steam locomotive was built in the United Kingdom in 1804 by Richard Trevithick. He was a British engineer. He was born in Cornwall. We passed Cornwall yesterday, of course. On the 21st of February 1804, the world's first steam-powered railway journey took place when Trevithick's unnamed steam engine, or steam locomotive rather, hauled a train along the tramway of the Penydarren Ironworks near Merthyr Tydfil in South Wales, not far from where we will be tomorrow. Previously, that track had been used to have ponies pulling carts along it. He now gave them a mechanized way of doing it. This is a replica at the National Waterfront Museum in Swansea, a bit further along the coast than where we'll be tomorrow. The father of railways is generally reckoned to be George Stephenson, born in 1781 in a place called Wylam in Northumberland. We'll be very close to that when we get to Newcastle upon Tyne next week, up in the English northeast. In 1814, George Stephenson inspired the early locomotives of Trevithick, Murray and Headley. He persuaded the manager of the Killingworth colliery where he worked to allow him to build a steam-powered machine because he was inspired by those people. Stephenson played a pivotal role in the development and widespread adoption of the steam locomotive. In 1829, he built the locomotive Rocket, which I'm sure you have heard of, which entered in and won the Rainhill trials. And this success led to Stephenson establishing his company as the preeminent builder of steam locomotives for railways. Built by George and continued by his son Robert, the Robert Stephenson and Company Locomotive No. 1 was the first steam locomotive to carry passengers on a public rail line. And this was from Stockton to Darlington in 1825. And that line still operates today. Again, not far from Newcastle on Tyne. It's been taken out of service a few times, but there are trains running on. Now, although they were soon replaced by the railways, the canals played a very important role in the development of industry. The modern canal system in Britain came into being because the Industrial Revolution demanded an economic and reliable way to transport coal from the coal fields to the places where things were constructed and to take the constructed commodities from there to market, and in large quantities. The old turnpike roads simply took too long and didn't accommodate the volume that was required. Industrialists like Josiah Wedgwood needed his delicate china to be delivered in pristine condition, not jogged around on the back of a donkey on a dodgy road. You can see here how a modern recreation, or actually a restoration of a historic narrowboat demonstrates how cargo could be carried and relatively calmly on its journey. There was an economic recession in the late 1830s, relatively minor one, but after that, There was rapid growth in getting through to the 1870s. Everything sprung from a group of new innovations in what was called the Second Industrial Revolution. And these new innovations included the large-scale manufacture of machine tools and the use of increasingly advanced machinery in steam-powered factories. And new steel-making processes began to replace ironworking. Now, a machine tool is a tool for manufacturing, whether it be screws or cogs or wheels or whatever. They employ some sort of tool that does the rolling, the cutting, the shaping, and included the screw cutting lathe, the cylinder boring machine, and the milling machine. And these enabled things to be produced in larger quantities. Rather than having one person sitting there with a chisel or a file, the machine could do that, and he could supervise the machine. And in turn, these developments resulted in much more mechanization in factories. Indeed, mechanized cotton spinning, powered by steam or water, increased the output of a worker by a factor of around 500. The power loom and the cotton gin also brought improvements in productivity, and big gains also occurred in spinning and weaving of wool and linen, but nowhere near as dramatic as in cotton production. In iron making, the substitution of coal, or more accurately, its derivative coke, in place of charcoal, produced far higher temperatures, far more concentrated heat, far more lasting heat, and it lowered the fuel cost of pig iron and wrought iron production. Using coke also allowed large blast furnaces, resulting in greater volumes to be produced. We've talked about coal, we've looked at the importance of iron, but as the 19th century progressed, and especially into the 20th century, it was the steel industry that had the next great impact. Now, steel is an alloy of iron and carbon and other elements. Because of its high tensile strength and its low cost, it became a major component used in buildings, in infrastructure, tools, ships, vehicles, automobiles, which were now a factor in machines, appliances, and weapons. Iron is the base metal of steel, and steel had been produced in bloomery furnaces for thousands of years. But its large-scale industrial use only began after the more efficient production methods were devised in the 17th century. The Gilchrist-Thomson process. Don't worry, there is no quiz at the end of this. The Gilchrist-Thomson process refined the quality of steel. And with their introductions, mild steel replaced wrought iron. Wrought iron for smiths to forge into consumer goods was still made in small forges, as it had been forever. However, these grew as new processes were adopted in the ensuing years. Rolling replaced hammering for consolidating wrought iron and expelling some of the dross and some of the air. Rolling was 15 times faster than hammering with a trip hammer. Roller mills were first used for making sheets, but later were developed for rolling structural shapes and angles and rails, and as a result, the small forges started to disappear. Oh, there were many social effects during this time, as I mentioned earlier on. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, most of the workforce were employed in agriculture, either as self-employed farmers, as landowners, or as tenants, or even as landless agricultural labourers, which of course was an important part of it. It was common for families in various parts of the world to spin yarn, to weave cloth, to make their own clothing, and for market production, to raise some funds or even to barter. At the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, India, China, and the regions of Iraq and elsewhere in Asia and the Middle East produced most of the world's cotton cloth, while Europeans produced wool and linen cloth. In Britain, in the 16th century, the putting out system by which farmers and townspeople produced goods for market in their homes, often described as a cottage industry, was being practiced. Typical putting out jobs included spinning and weaving. Merchant capitalists would typically provide the raw materials, paid workers by the piece, so hence the term piecework, and they were responsible for the sale of the goods. Of course, much of the cottage industry was staffed by women because they could do that at home, and they stood to lose out as factories were developed once production was taken out of their home. Now, this cartoon by John Leach was published in Punch magazine, a satirical magazine, published in 1845. It's titled Cheap Clothing. The irony of this cartoon from nearly 200 years ago is that the story hasn't really changed. Well, it has changed because we've consciously offshored the harsh working conditions to countries far away, and we now criticize them for causing pollution, for poor working conditions, and for undercutting home production costs, while we force them to sell to us, to manufacture for us, at often impossibly uneconomic prices. In a more collective interpretation, it can be said that capitalism created the conditions for women's emancipation. Academics Tilly and Scott have identified 3 stages of women in English history. In the pre-industrial era, where production was mostly for home use and women produced much of the needs of the household. The second stage was the family wage economy of early industrialization. The entire family depended on the collective wages of its members, including husband, wife, and older children, not necessarily that old. And the very rapid growth in population in the 19th century in the cities included the new industrial and manufacturing cities like Birmingham, Manchester, Leeds, Sheffield, Edinburgh, and London. People moved in so rapidly that there just wasn't enough capital to build adequate housing for everyone who had previously lived in pretty squalid farm cottages in the past, and they were given nothing better than that in the cities. So in places like Southampton, Glasgow, Belfast, life was tough. I was going to say was tough. It often still is to this day. Clean water, sanitation, public health facilities were certainly inadequate then. The death rate was high, especially infant mortality, tuberculosis among young adults, cholera from polluted water, and typhoid. All of them were endemic. And unlike rural areas, there were no famines, such as the one that devastated Ireland in the 1840s, and child labour was a growing shame. It took concerned individuals, including many Quaker-founded businesses, to change things. The same concerned folk who tackled the scandal of slavery. Lots of British brands were built by Quaker families. The chocolate makers, Cadbury, Fry's, Rowntree's, the banking families, Barclays and Lloyds, Bradshaw's Guides, one of the staples for travelling in the day, Bryant and Mays, Clark's Shoes, you will know of Clark's Shoes, Waterford Crystal from just along the coast here. Even the Inman line that I talked about yesterday, they typically provided better working conditions, including minimum age limits and decent housing. And often they built, purpose-built, Garden City-style creations, like Cadbury's near Birmingham. But not all employers were so philanthropic. And early in the 19th century, a secret oath-based organisation of English textile workers called the Luddites began to destroy textile machinery as a form of protest. The group was protesting against the use of machinery in a fraudulent and deceitful manner because the people installing the machinery didn't make clear that jobs would be lost as a result. Lack of suffrage, together with oppressive laws from Parliament, culminated in a region-wide rebellion. It lasted from 1811 to 1816. Mill and factory owners were known to shoot protesters, and eventually the movement was suppressed with legal and military force. But the result of that was that workers united in the formation of trade unions. And often workers felt it necessary to strike for better conditions. The general strike in May 1926, led by northern miners, was a result of a combination of a drop in coal prices and the disillusionment of men returning from the Great War to find they didn't have the jobs that they left behind. But there had been another, fortunately, far less violent reaction against industrialism. The arts and crafts movement was an international trend in decorative and fine arts. It also began in Britain, and it flourished all across Europe and across America from about 1880 to 1920. It was inspired by some of the architecture of Augustus Pugin, the writer John Ruskin, designer William Morris. They had differing attitudes to how mechanization was acceptable, and they wanted to preserve the traditional craftsmanship and the traditional beauty in practical objects. And you can see these ideas in the work of Rennie Mackintosh, the Glasgow School of Art, in Frank Lloyd Wright's buildings in America, and the simple style of many Scandinavian designers. So to round off the story of coal and steel, I mentioned earlier the importance of mechanization and the vision of men of science in driving the development of Britain's economic revolution. In some of my other talks, we look at how this was combined with the spirit of adventure and commerce that created the British Empire. And several of the ports that we are visiting on this trip are renowned for shipbuilding, for trade, for the ebb and flow of people, immigrants, emigrants, and the workers who fueled the Industrial Revolution. Harland and Wolff in Belfast is famous for having built the majority of the ships intended for the White Star Line. I mentioned yesterday the Olympic-class trio, Titanic, Olympic, and Britannic. But there was also the Royal Navy's HMS Belfast, Royal Lines Andes, Shaw Savills, Southern Cross, Union Castles, RMS Pendennis Castle, and P&O's Canberra, which saw service in the Falklands War as well as a luxury cruise ship. Scotland was once the shipbuilder to the world, and the heart of its industry was sited on the south bank of the River Clyde in the Glasgow region of Govan. And when we get to Rothesay in a few days' time, the port looks towards the mouth of the Clyde. And I think some of you, I gather, may well be going into Glasgow while we are there. And if you do, you will travel along the banks of the Clyde, and you will see some of the shipbuilding that is certainly still there to this day. John Brown and Company of Clydebank was a Scottish marine engineer and shipbuilding firm. They built many notable ships, the RMS Lusitania, HMS Hood, HMS Repulse, the Queen Mary, the Queen Elizabeth, the QE2, and more. Now, it's a shadow of its former past today, unfortunately, mostly through political, lack of political will, I guess. But today, there is still the Ferguson Marine Engineering there, and there is BAE Systems. So there are new naval vessels and new commercial vessels being built there. Then later on, the ship calls into Newcastle, were docking at the Wallsend terminal, the Wallsend being the end of Hadrian's Wall, and Newcastle on the Tyne, as well as the Tees, not far away, were very important shipbuilding towns as well. So at the beginning I asked, why here and why then? Now I hope I've answered those questions adequately. Kathy and I are always interested to pursue conversations beyond the Grand Salon, and next time you drink a cup of tea out of Wedgwood China, you'll recall that it all started here. I'm very happy to take any questions if you have any.